right, guys, some big primary results in California. 2 races in particular that got a lot of national attention. The first one we want to start with is the recall of progressive prosecutor of San Francisco, Chesa Boudin. The vote was not particularly close in the end. 60% voted to recall him. Joining us to break down what this means, both in terms of San Francisco, but more broadly for the movement of criminal justice reform, is Ross Barkan. He is a longtime friend of the show. He also, hold on, let me pull up all his titles. He's a writer for New York Magazine, columnist with Jacobin, also contributor at The Nation, author of 3 books, including The Night Burns Bright. Great to see you, Ross.
Good to see you, man.
Thank you for having me. Excited to be back.
Yeah, our pleasure. So you have been following this race closely, and you wrote an analysis. Let's go ahead and put that up on the screen. And you headline it here, and this is again regarding Chesa Boudin, the progressive prosecutor in San Francisco, being recalled. You title it, "The Backlash Has Begun." So for people who haven't been following this race, who don't know anything about Chesa, tell us about him, his approach, what it means to be a progressive prosecutor, and why he became such a sort of lightning rod.
Sure. So Chesa Boudin is elected District Attorney of San Francisco in 2019. He runs as a proud progressive, very much in the mold of other progressive prosecutors around the country, Larry Krasner in Philadelphia, Wesley Bell in St. Louis. And immediately his tenure is rocky. It coincides with the pandemic. It coincides with a rise in certain types of crime in San Francisco. You have seen a rise in homicides, though it's been rather small, but you have seen a surge in hate crimes against Asians. You've seen a rise in burglaries, car break-ins. And so there's been really a general sense that the quality of life in San Francisco has been declining, and there's a major homelessness problem there as well. So all of this fell on his shoulders. And also, since he was a reformist progressive prosecutor, he was not asking for cash bail. He was clashing with police. He was using diversion programs much more than other conventional DAs. So many felt he wasn't going hard enough on certain criminals like drug dealers. And so it was a confluence of various factors that led to him getting recalled. And there were conservatives who were very angry at him. There's the Asian community that was very angry at him. There were regular liberals, especially older voters, who were very angry with him, who felt that for a variety of reasons, he was to blame for the state of San Francisco. So they got the signatures together. There was right-wing money behind it. There was a grassroots push behind it. And on Tuesday, he was overwhelmingly recalled. I think the split ended up being around 60-40. And now London Breed, who's the mayor, she will appoint his replacement as DA. And just for the viewers out there, San Francisco DA, it's a storied place. Kamala Harris was once the DA of San Francisco. So certainly it can be a launching pad for other things.
Place to watch. Yeah, I think Gavin Newsom too, if I'm not mistaken.
He's the mayor,
He was the mayor. That's right. So you know, the true
Dianne
trusted
Feinstein
team
was the mayor too.
There you go. Great history. I mean, I think it's really interesting, Ross. And you know, so I read your piece. I know you talked a little bit to Chesa, but there seems to be quite a bit of cope on his part, which I'd love for you to guide into. I mean, he tries to say like, oh, crime is down except for murder, which is up, you know, like 37% while he's over there. And I just got the general sense, and full disclosure, I literally know some of the people who funded this thing, David Sachs and others. I am not, I am not uncolored by my own personal biases. My own sister had to leave San Francisco because crime was so bad. So I can just go ahead and put all that on the table. What I got from him is that unlike Krasner and even I forget the guy's name in LA, unlike Gascon, yeah, he did not seem to actually care in a public way about crime. And that seemed to be the real nail in his coffin. There were all those stories that came out of he would meet with an Asian family and say he was promised he was going to do something about their murder, and then he would drop the charges. He would say that he wouldn't want to charge drug dealers because many of them were illegal immigrants and he would prefer that they don't get deported. These are all things that he said on record. So am I wrong in saying that dispositionally and almost as a politician, he just seems far worse than Krasner and Gascon, even if they all may even have the same policy?
No, I would agree with that. And in my long piece on Boudin, I noted that he's not in any way, was not a natural politician. He was someone who did not come out of the typical political ranks of San Francisco, which is a place, as we said before, is kind of a remarkable launching pad for national politics, whether it's Pelosi, Kamala Harris, Gavin Newsom. It is a place where talent is manufactured. He was not a natural politician, and at times he was tone deaf. And he was not good at building alliances with communities. He was not good at building alliances with the Democratic establishment, though he had endorsements. The reality was the Democratic establishment was not eager to defend him, particularly the mayor, London Breed, who did not support the recall, but also was not against the recall. And that was very key. So I would agree that unlike Krasner, Boudin was not an adept politician. I would also add the quirk of the recall makes it hard because he had no opponent. Krasner was able to defeat a primary opponent. Typically, that's what happens. It's a referendum on the person, but there's another person running. Gavin Newsom gets recalled. Here's Larry Elder. You can point to Elder and say, I'm better. Boudin had no one to point to. I think that recall environment makes it very hard. But yes, he was not a natural politician, and he's not a natural alliance builder. I think that was very clear.
Yeah. Ross, can you talk about the backlash in the Asian American community, specifically in the Chinese community, against Boudin? Because now that community, they were very instrumental in a couple of school board recalls that were also, significant in San Francisco, and a core part of the sort of grassroots backlash against Boudin, which I think was very real. Where did that come from? And broadening out from San Francisco, what do you think that says about, I even hate saying the word Asian American community because it's such a broad and diverse group of people, but what do you think it says about the Democratic Party and their relationship with this constituency?
It's definitely a warning to the Democratic Party that it's a constituency that can't be taken for granted. Majority of Asian American voters, and yes, it's a very broad category. You're talking about Chinese voters, Korean voters, Thai voters, and so on, vote Democrat. But right now, I think any politician running in an area with an Asian community who is a Democrat cannot sit back and say these people are automatically in my column. You see it in New York City, too, at the mayoral race in 2021. The Republican candidate tied Eric Adams in the heavily Chinese and Korean neighborhood of Flushing in Queens, which was usually never happens. The Democrat always wins, especially for mayor. So wherever you go, especially on the coasts, this is a big challenge for Democrats, particularly because crime is overall higher, not as high as it was historically, but it's not something you can say to the average voter who's maybe been mugged, who's been threatened in some way, knows someone who was killed. You can't go, well, it was worse in the 1990s. Many of them do not remember the 1990s, and so that doesn't mean anything to people. So I do think it's a big challenge for Democrats. It's a big challenge for the progressive wing, as well as the moderate wing. And I do think Democrats have to recalibrate in some way how they talk about crime, how they talk about policing, progressives in particular. It's a very tricky subject. It's very challenging, and it varies by city too. The crime picture in San Francisco, for example, is not the crime picture in Baltimore, right? Yeah. Homicides actually are not a big problem in San Francisco. For the size of its city, they're quite low, and they haven't risen by that much. But you have other types of crimes that have risen. So people do feel a sense of lack of safety, decline of quality of life. These things do matter, and I think they matter a lot in the immigrant Asian community, particularly the many people targeted for hate crimes. So I do think Democrats cannot take them for granted, and Republicans are making gains there, and that could continue. There's a rule that says it would not continue.
I think we should stick on this point. It's very important, which is that, these people are not Republicans. Like, they just rejected any independent candidate. But as you're seeing in LA, a billionaire is very likely to be the next mayor of Los Angeles, built explicitly on the promise of cleaning up LA. Here now, Chesa Boudin gets, and it's not like London Breed is some Republican, but she framed herself here as a centrist. Why is it easier, seemingly to my eyes, that a London Breed and an Eric Adams can acknowledge the reality of crime to extraordinarily political success, but Chesa, Krasner, Gascon, and all others, they just seem to have a real issue just acknowledging that people can look around and be like, I do not feel safe in this city. Why do they have such a problem validating that concept? It just seems so insane to me.
Yeah, well, I would first push back on just a few points. Caruso is not a lock to be the next mayor of LA. He'll be in a runoff with Karen Bass, and that's going to be quite contentious. And it wouldn't shock me if Bass won in November. There's going to be a lot of time for that race to sort itself out.
Fair enough.
Eric Adams is an interesting one. Extraordinary political success. I don't know. His approval ratings are quite low right now, ironically, because of the crime issue. In a sense, centrists, I'd say Democrats and Republicans alike, have sort of, this challenge where if you campaign on, let's say, a city being out of control, on I will solve the crime issue, if then you're in power and you don't, voters can turn on you. So you're starting to see that happen with Eric Adams in New York. For London Breed in San Francisco, it's her problem now. And a lot of the issues that festered were not Chesa Boudin's fault. They dated back a decade or more. Homelessness in particular, a huge, huge problem in San Francisco and LA. So that is one problem that I would say even the center or the right has. If it does come into power, voters are astute enough to go, well, you said you clean it up, now go clean it up. And then crime maybe doesn't fall right away. But yeah, I think to answer your question, it can be tricky for progressives who run on these reform platforms who are saying we support rehabilitation versus locking people up in jail and are very wary of falling back on sort of the 1980s and 1990s paradigm. Now, do you overcorrect for that? I think you can, because quality of life does matter. I think for socialists and leftist candidates too, I think it's a mistake to ignore quality of life concerns in general. It does matter if your city is dirty. It does matter if it's not, just a pleasant place to be, if garbage is piling up in the streets, even putting aside crime. So I do think the left shouldn't cede ground on those issues. And I think there are intelligent and nuanced ways to talk about crime where police do have to do their job and solve crimes. And it also doesn't make sense to give someone a life sentence for a drug offense or something like that. So there's a lot of nuance there. But if crime is rising, it can be very hard to even talk nuance, because I think whenever crime is up, the right gets that advantage because their solutions sound much better and they seem like they'll happen much more quickly.
Yeah, they're very, here's what we're gonna be tough on these people. We're gonna clean it up. It's gonna happen. But I think that Eric Adams' point is a good one that, he has done those things. He famously cleared out these homeless encampments and, what was kind of brutal way, but the results haven't followed. And so people are turning on him as well. In San Francisco, it also seems to me that there's a, obviously it's one of the most unequal places in the entire country. The only people who can afford to live there are basically wealthy people and then, people who are experiencing homelessness, right? There's very little middle class left in the city. And so the type of progressivism that I think is embraced by some is, doesn't want to compromise on anything like building a lot more affordable housing that might compromise, their views of the Bay or infringe on their, on their property or change their property values. And so I think that also creates a sort of limit, because ultimately as a progressive prosecutor, you're not going to be able to solve all the ills of society or all the ills of your city. But you do have to be responsive in, in the areas where you can actually make a difference, or at least validate people's legitimate concerns that, I want my kids to feel safe when we're walking down the street. The thing I think about Ross a lot is the sewer socialists, who were very popular because, they had a broader ideology, socialist ideology, but what they focused on was actually delivering for people tangibly and materially and competently in their day-to-day lives. And sometimes I feel like on the progressive side, there can be this sort of ideological disconnect versus actually focusing on how do we improve people's lives today.
Yeah, I would agree. I think for DSA candidates who win office, constituent services remains very important. And that is such a big element of this. The sewer socialists are a great model. Milwaukee was run by socialists for 50 or 60 years. You brought up San Francisco and the vanishing middle class. I wrote it in my first long New York Magazine piece about this race. that can't be separated, I think, from the outcome of the Boudin recall. Larry Krasner won re-election fairly decisively, in part because he ran up pretty big margins in the Black community of Philadelphia. Now, of course, Black voters are also concerned about crime and do care about quality of life issues, but it's notable that San Francisco's Black population is almost non-existent at this point. There really is this massive gulf where, yes, you have extremely wealthy people, you have some middle-class people, and then you have a lot of very poor, basically homeless people, not even really working class people anymore. So demographically, it's a city that's very different than some other cities, certainly like New York or Philadelphia, for example, where the electorate is a bit more complex. That, I think, class divide and also just the absence of a middle class can't be ignored. Now, a middle class could have voted to recall Boudin. I'm not saying like a working class Black population saves a tone-deaf DA. What I'm saying is with the Krasner case, you did see an example of that happening. And also, to your other point, yes, a district attorney can't solve a lot of problems. A DA can't even really control a crime rate. I mean, there's no good evidence that has ever been true. The police have to do their job. The police in San Francisco, from what I understand, I don't live there, I've studied it a little bit, are fairly inept. The NYPD gets a lot of flack, but the NYPD is decent at solving crimes, at not discharging their weapons. The San Francisco PD seems to be on some sort of like de facto or almost strike where literally they don't really patrol and seem to do their job. So the DA cannot control that either. And the housing picture in California in general is broken. Studying it made me appreciate, I think, the East Coast approach a bit more, because in New York, you can build. We do rezone things. You do have high rises. San Francisco building is incredibly restricted. That's true in LA as well. And when you have decades of no housing construction effectively, you get these tent cities. And I don't think it's progressive to have tent cities. I think the issue is progressives support them because then they feel like the people don't go anywhere else. But I do think there is a breaking point coming in California where a lot of people are saying we cannot have people on the streets like this, and let's find a solution. So Caruso actually ran on building a lot more shelter beds. So did Karen Bass. There is going to have to be some change at some point in the California housing picture because it is profoundly broken. That's the fault of Democrats. It's the fault of moderate Democrats. It's the fault of progressive Democrats. It's the fault of Republicans, too. Remember, Arnold Schwarzenegger is governor of the state. California has a Republican tradition. It's the fault of the entire political class. I think everyone should come in for a drubbing when it comes to the California homelessness and housing situation. It really has festered for now decades, and we're seeing this breaking point coming now in the 2020s.
Yeah.
I appreciate your analysis very much, Ross. As nuanced as I think we can get from the left, I encourage people to go and read your piece and to read as much as they can about this, because I do think that this is part of a bigger thing that's going to be happening across the country, as you even allude to in the piece. So thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Ross. Great to see you.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely, man. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'm sorry the show is going to be late today. We had a bunch of interviews here. Our schedule went long. It is what it is. I hope you guys will love us and forgive us.
We didn't want to cut off our long gun debate. We had to get it all the way into it.
We have to do it.
I hope you enjoy that.
We had to do it. It is what it is. It's okay. Please forgive us, everybody. We're really sorry. But we'll get it to you as soon as possible. So thank you all so much for supporting us. We really appreciate it. To people who are just watching this as a clip. And we will see you all next week. We've got great partner content for you all over the weekend.
That's right. Love you guys. See you here next week. Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.